I know this story may sound fictional. A lot of people don't believe me when I tell it, but I can assure you that the other person involved also witnessed what occurred this night. It happened 11 years ago with an ex-girlfriend. It actually changed our relationship for the worse, and we ended up breaking up a few weeks after. Nonetheless, I still remember this like it was yesterday, due to how unexplainable it was. My girlfriend at the time wanted to surprise me with what she said was an overnight surprise trip. I obliged and felt like I was a pretty lucky guy for her to do something that required that much planning. After packing a duffel bag full of clothes and toiletries, we left for what I thought was a resort, or some kind of hotel stay. 2.5 hours passed when we pulled off the main road and headed down an off-road path. I asked her if this was a camping trip, and she replied, yes. To be honest, I was disappointed as I didn't really like camping. Not to mention, I wish I knew to pack my hiking shoes. I didn't complain, of course, because it was still a romantic gesture. 15 minutes on this rough road, we finally pulled into a camping ground. The first thing I noticed was that there really wasn't anyone around us. It made sense though, this was really far off the beaten path. I was actually surprised her car made it that far, considering how harsh the road was. Anyway, we make a fire pit and she cooks dinner. Everything is going just fine and we are really feeling each other. We of course take it to the tent as the sun goes down and we are vibing off each other. Yeah, it's what you would expect things would happen, as young college kids do. This is when the first strange occurrence happens. I hear scratching noises on the side of the tent. I try to remember if we set the tent up next to a brush. Maybe the wind is causing branches to rustle against the tent. Oh well, that's the woods. Maybe it's a bird or something else. It stops rustling. As we continue chilling, as if nothing happened. Then things escalate in a strange manner. It's like the wind stopped and the environment became silent. We both felt uneasy, causing us to get sort of knocked off out of our playful mood. She laid next to me as we tried to concentrate on listening, to hear if there was a bear or some other animal in the area. Then it happened in an instant. Something akin to an explosion hit the tent tremendously hard. I could compare it to, say, if a log was thrown like a battering ram against the side of the tent. I say this because it literally pushed the material in forcefully and it felt dangerous. A surge of adrenaline lit through my body as I felt like something violent was outside the tent. I never knew if I was a fight or flight guy, but I guess my next action gives me some idea. I yell aloud, "Give me the knife and get the flashlight," as I scramble up and unzip the tent with the tools in my hand. My first thought was that I was going to confront some psycho that was messing with us, perhaps with a baseball bat or some kind of battering weapon. I kid you not, I launched myself out of that tent and stood up in a flurry to confront my attacker. A few breaths pass as a cold feeling sets in. I do a 360 scan to nothing but silence and darkness. Maybe it was a branch that fell on the tent. Nope. There was absolutely nothing on the ground where the thud was heard. "Hello?" I yelled again and again, to no response, until only a moment later in the silence, a chill shot up my spine. "Get the keys and get out of the tent," I said in a frantic tone as my girlfriend listened and now joined me. I looked at a car that we arrived in and noticed it was about 30 yards out by the shoddy off-road path. She didn't even need to know what I was thinking as we both just started to speed walk towards it. You might be thinking at this point that I'm overreacting, but truly I cannot describe the terror that washed over me when I looked out in the darkness after investigating the tent. I could feel like something was watching me, and to top it off, it was eerily silent. I know she confirmed my suspicions when she started for the car immediately, without question. Our instincts were telling us to get the hell out of there. The walk to the car was unnerving and felt like a football field away. But finally, we got into the car with keys in hand. I took the driver's seat. After turning the keys, led to some relief as the engine started. Instinctively, I locked the doors and turned the headlights on. We sat for about 3 seconds trying to rationalize what was happening when my girlfriend started exclaiming, "My laptop is moving. Something is in the tent." She said this because she brought her laptop to serve as a lantern after dark. We of course left it in a hurry, as well as other items. I saw what she saw. It was items being rustled around 30 yards away. Without further hesitation, I put the car in gear and started down the rough road. As I tried to calmly drive the car down the dirt path quickly, but carefully. Now it was a very rough road, and I did not want to get stranded out there. The strangest thing happened next. A loud, piercing ringing noise rang from inside the car's cabin. I turned the radio on and off. I checked the windows. I asked my girlfriend if her car had ever made such noises. She said no. I asked her again if she could hear it. Maybe it was just me being under stress. And she said, yes, I hear it, and that she didn't know what it was. She sounded confused and panicked. Now, I want to write this off as a car problem, but if you were in there with me, you would describe it as some kind of bell continuously ringing. It didn't sound like any car noise I'd ever heard. My next instinct as I grew up as a pastor's kid, I just remember praying for 10 minutes as I was convinced it was supernatural or demonic. We endured the screech for 10 grueling minutes. As to my relief, it ended suddenly. It didn't fade out or go quiet. The loud ring literally stopped in an instant. I can't describe the feeling in that car when it stopped. It is so strange to look back and remember that I felt internally that the ordeal was over once the ring stopped. Everything felt normal again. The panic, the chills, all of it went away in an instant. We ended up down the road another 45 minutes and finally stopped at a trucker diner. We slept in the parking lot. Or at least she did. I was just still on edge. In an attempted bravery the next day, we went back to the camping site as the sun was up. We investigated, but saw no tracks or anything except for the contents of the tent had been tossed around, but still accounted for. I was hoping they were missing so I could write it off as people screwing with us and plundering our tent, but that didn't seem to be the case. We were packed up and gone in less than 10 minutes as the area still felt weird. I haven't been camping since. I would go again, but next time I want an RV, or at least a relatively known location with others around. This place was in the remote mountains of Payson, Arizona, far from civilization. About a year ago, I moved my family and I to a home way out in the woods in Tennessee. I wanted to be brief here, but I need to get this off my chest. And after looking into this matter a little more, I have a lot more details that I think will paint a clear picture in the end, so please bear with me. The nights here can be extremely loud. Between the crickets, the tree frogs, and the cicadas, it can almost be deafening. One night, not too long ago, after we moved in, I'd forgotten something in my car, and I headed outside to get it. The first thing that struck me as odd was that my dog wouldn't go outside with me. My dog goes everywhere with me, as I am her whole world, but not this night. As I held the door open, she looked out and then looked at me like, nope. So I walked out and shut the door behind me. The second thing that caught me off guard was that there was not a peep. It was dead silent. Still shrugged this off and walked down my front steps and headed down to my car. When I'd gotten about 10 feet from my car, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt as though something was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing. After I reached my car for what I had forgotten to grab earlier, I had this feeling like something was moving towards me. I took a step back and checked around me. All of a sudden, I heard one of my hedges next to me that lined the walkway to our front door rattle. At first, I thought it was a rabbit that I'd spooked, as I had seen one just earlier in the day right where this was. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of a large rock, about the size of a cantaloupe, landing a few feet away from me. It hit the walkway and bounced into a shrub. I drew my gun and called out and said, whoever this was is about to be shot. After a few seconds of nothing, I began to think that maybe this was some local teenagers messing with the new people. I holstered my sidearm, turned and started walking back to my front door. Almost as soon as I turned towards my house, I heard this deep, panting sound. It sounded like a huge dog, but what made me nope back to my front door was that it sounded like it was right behind me. I leapt up onto my porch, turned and drew my gun again, expecting something right there. But again, there was nothing. So a couple of weeks later, I was on my porch at night, sitting on a bench with my wife. She got up and walked inside to get something. And as soon as she shut the door, I heard that panting sound again. I couldn't see anything, yet this sounded like it was right on top of me. The sound was coming from everywhere and it was very loud. Again, I couldn't see anything, so I noped it back inside my house. Now at this point, I was questioning moving here, but after nothing else really happened, I let it go. A month or so later, it was a really rainy and stormy night. This is around 9 p.m, and my wife and I enjoy listening to the rain and talking about how relaxing the rain is. Me growing up in Oregon loved the rain, and for the past 10 years, we lived in Vegas, where it would dump the entire year of rain in a day and then be bone dry for the rest of the year. For my wife, who grew up in Nevada, rain was such a rare thing, and she loved going outside and watching the rain. So for us, this is an enjoyable experience. Except this night in particular, things took a weird turn. As we were sitting there talking about the rain and relaxing, my wife stops me and said, "Did you hear that?" I said, "No, what did you hear?" She said, "I swear it sounded like a small child calling for help out in the woods beside our house." I said, "No, I didn't hear anything." After a few moments of listening intently, she said, "There it is again." I said to her that I didn't hear a thing and asked her if she was sure she wasn't just hearing things. She looked at me offended that I didn't hear anything and said, "No, I am positive. How could you not hear that? It was our son. I think he's out there and got lost." I said, "No, he's in the house sleeping on the couch." We then both looked through the blinds that were open right behind us, and we could see all of our children laying there. She said, "That's so weird. I swear it sounds like our son." "Well, it isn't him. He's right there. Besides, I don't hear anything." She stands up and says, "Wow, he's really crying out for help. I need to go look for him." Now at this point, if you knew my wife, you would know she's absolutely creeped out by the woods and wouldn't be caught dead walking into them during the daylight, much less at night during a storm. I grabbed her hand and said, "I've been listening intently. There is absolutely nobody calling out for help. You need to stay here." At this point, I'm getting worried about her. She was acting completely out of character. Not to mention that at the time, she's 8 months pregnant with our baby daughter. She then says, "What if there is some child out there lost in the woods?" I told her, well, first off, I would be able to hear them too. Secondly, there are no other kids around here for miles, and the odds of them being lost 100 feet from our house that's lit up like a Christmas tree is nil. She then says, "I know, but what if it's a kid?" Before I could say anything else, she stands up and starts walking toward the stairs. I jumped up and grabbed her hand again and said, "No, you're not. Get in the house. I don't know what's going on, but you need to go inside." She then complies, and we both go inside. I didn't know what this was, but it freaked me out. A few months after this, just as it was getting dark outside, I heard the front door to our house open, and I got up to investigate. We have autistic 6-year-old twins, and we have the door set up so that they can't open it without us there. So to hear this sound, it could only be my wife. What was weird was the fact that she usually doesn't go outside without saying something to me. I walked out front and saw my wife walking down our private road towards the drive on the side of our house. I asked her what she's doing, and she says she was sitting on the back patio and kept hearing a baby crying out in the woods. I said, "Seriously, and you just decided to walk off into the woods to investigate?" She then looks out at the woods and says, "See, there it is again." And again, I can't hear anything, but what I did notice is that it was completely silent outside again. I told her, just like before, the chances of a baby being out in the woods outside our house is slim, and that she needed to get back in the house. She said, "What if someone left a baby out there?" I said to her, well, if that were true, I would also hear it. Now at this point, I was really starting to worry about my wife's mental health. I actually asked her to see a psychiatrist, and she did. Now looking back, I feel really bad about this, knowing what I know. A key to this moment was that my wife had just given birth to a baby girl a month before. A few days after this, we were out on the front porch. It's early evening, and I had just mowed the lawn this day. our 3-year-old son was riding around on his little car in front of the house. Now, he knows that he's not allowed outside of a certain area that we mapped off. He loves playing outside, but with the road behind 50 feet from our front porch, we have to be careful, as a lot of boaters will fly through after drinking all day on their boats. As we are talking, we are both keeping an eye on him. A neighbour drives by and stops to say hi for a second. This interaction took approximately 8 seconds, as all they said were, "How are things?" We said good, and he told us he would stop by later as his wife got something for the kids, who happens to be one of their teachers in school. And we said, "Okay, great," and he drove off. I looked over where our son was, and he was gone. I called out his name and ran over to the side of the house, and I could hear his car on our side drive. I scolded him for leaving the area, and he said something in his 3-year-old gibberish and pointed to the woods behind our house. I told him he had 5 seconds to get back up to the front of the house, or else. And he adamantly pointed back in the direction of the woods and kept trying to tell me something. I looked off in the direction of the woods and just assumed he saw a deer or squirrel or something and wanted to see it up close. I walked him back up to the front of the house, and he cried the whole way there. He got really upset that I wouldn't let him go into the woods, but I just wrote this off as him being curious, and most 3-year-old boys are. Now this instance isn't isolated, as our twins have done similar things, but nothing quite as extreme as this one. There have been nights where we had just laid down for the night and heard a loud bang on the side of our house on the wall behind our bed. It was so loud that I jumped up and looked out the window. Our floodlight had come on, but I could see nothing. Now, the weird part about this is that our bedroom sits about 12 feet from the ground level, as we have a full-size basement that's cinder block. I put on my slippers and grabbed one of my 12-gauge shotguns and walked outside to investigate. It was dead silent again. The floodlight that's on the side of the house had clicked off at this point, so I walked over to the end of the deck and shined my light around the yard. There was nothing. I walked around the house and shined the light around intently. As I approached the back side of my house, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like someone was watching me. I shined my light up in the trees, but again, nothing. I rounded the corner, and the first thing I noticed was that my 3 dogs that were in their area weren't making a peep. Now, our dogs have no filter and will bark at anyone and everyone. This includes me. So to see them all hiding with their tails between their legs, not making a peep, really had me worried. As I kept walking, all of a sudden the crickets and frogs started making sounds again. It was as if someone had flicked a switch. I walked back into the house and told my wife that I hadn't seen anything. She shrugged it off, said okay, as long as our dogs were okay. Due to the circumstances that night, I decided to let the dogs in and sleep with us. This very same thing has happened on all 4 exterior walls of our house. It's random and annoying, but just like this instance, every time there is nothing going on outside. There have also been times where we were sitting in the house and I was watching a movie. My wife walked over to me and said, "Did you call me?" I said no, and she swears she heard me call a name in her ear. She said that it was definitely my voice, but she didn't understand because it sounded so close, and I was a good 20 feet away from her in my recliner. The important part to this was that she was sitting at the table doing something, and the slider to the backyard was open behind her. Now, our back patio sits about 20 feet off the ground and is like a balcony as it has no stair access outside. I think the previous owner built it for a barbecuing. There have been several instances where she would say she heard someone whisper in her ear, but she couldn't make out the sound. Again, I kept thinking she was going crazy, but as you will see, I think all of this is tied into this final moment where things are revealed. The last thing I want to mention before we get into what just happened is that I have a shooting range built behind my workshop on an opposite side of our property next to the main road. It is kind of on a down slope, but it works perfectly for what I need. The range itself is cut straight into the woods, going down about 100 yards or so. When you're at the down range, you have woods surrounding you on all sides, except back up to my shop. I have to say, it has always felt creepy when I am dealing with my targets or mowing. When you are down there, it feels like you're miles from anyone. One day, Around 5 in the evening, I was sighting in a new rifle scope. The sun was still up but was going to start to fade soon, so I knew this was going to be the final test. Up until this point, nothing really happened while I was making my multiple trips downrange other than this feeling of uneasiness. As I got downrange, I kept getting this feeling like someone or something was watching me. I looked around but didn't see anything. As I was placing stickers over my previous shots, I heard something big off to the side of me. It sounded like a large branch had snapped off a tree. Now, if you've been in Tennessee woods, you will know that a lot of branches fall off trees randomly out of nowhere. So this is nothing new, except this time it was very loud and sounded like fresh, strong wood, if that makes any sense. I turned and looked, but again, I couldn't see anything. I started walking back up to my rifle and I swear I heard someone right behind me. I turned around, but again saw nothing. As I started to walk again, I heard this deep growl. It was really deep and loud, and what's worse is that it was all around me. I turned around facing the range and started walking backwards. The thought of some rabid dog charging out of the bushes had me freaked out, so running wasn't a good idea. I slowly walked backwards up the hill to my rifle, but nothing happened. I grabbed my rifle and sprayed the target with rapid fire, hoping to scare off whatever was stalking me. I left 10 rounds in the mag and grabbed my rifle bag, quickly walking back up to the house. I never told my wife about this, as I didn't want her to freak out. Fast forward about a year later from when we moved in, and my niece is staying with us as a live-in nanny to earn money over summer break from college. We were on our way back from the store and about a mile from our house, and I saw 2 eyes reflecting in the headlights coming from a wide tree on the side of the road just ahead. It had caught my attention because they were higher than a deer, but a different colour and size. Just as I had said, "What is that?" and squinted, they vanished. I had made a comment that it was almost as if it had known I could see its eyes and moved. The colour was kind of a golden green, but they resembled the mannerism of a large cat, as they felt ominous. It's hard to explain, but I shrugged it off as we were passing the tree and saw nothing. A few moments later, we arrived at the house. As we were getting bags out of the car, my 3-year-old son came bolting out of the house, excited to see me. As I was waiting to help her carry in her bags, I heard my dog growl. I looked in the direction she was looking at. It was my neighbour's property across the street. Now what I saw has kept me up all night. Up until this point, I've always been sceptical, as I have never seen anything with my own 2 eyes. Even with what had happened to me the year prior, I still had my doubts that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. My neighbour's house sits adjacent to my house on about an acre lot. Directly in front of my house is a wall of woods, and directly behind my house is several thousand acres of untouched forest. As I was looking across the street to my neighbour's property, I saw a large dark figure between the trees at first. The movement caught me off guard, as it looked like something big, moving quickly on all 4s. Then, when it came out into clear view, it stood up and walked like a man. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. It was very tall, but what was strange about it was the distance it was covering, and the fact that when it was in front of his shed, I swear I could see through it. It was clearly walking quickly, but moving faster than any person could at a sprint. More importantly, there was no sound. It was like it was phasing in and out of reality as it moved. I said, "What the hell is that?" and realised that it was looking directly at us. It had moved at an angle away from us to minimise its time out in the open and moving as quickly as it could while still being silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realised that whatever it was stalking us. I told my niece to get in the house now, and I grabbed my son and booked it inside. I grabbed my AR-15 with a short scope and came back outside to see my niece still grabbing stuff out of her car. Knowing I told her firmly and clearly to get in the house, her disregard to my command annoyed me, but still, I watched over her without saying a word. As she was slowly walking, she turned towards the woods across the street from my house. Then she suddenly bolted for the house. She ran up the steps in a panicked state. I asked her what she saw, and her face was pale as a ghost. She said, "I heard something big in the woods walking loudly on the leaves, and when I turned toward it, I heard a deep guttural growl." I asked her why she didn't come when I told her, and she said she thought that I was talking to my son. I told her what I had seen, and she wanted to get a closer look to see if she could see something. I told her that it wasn't a good idea, and she went anyway. As she was walking down the walkway, I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching in the woods across the street. I told her to stop and come take the flashlight. Now at this point, she's about 6 feet away from my wife's SUV. As she turned and started walking back to me, I caught a glimpse of something grey and hairy bolt from behind the SUV back across the street and into the woods. My porch is a raised porch, and our SUV is about 6.5 feet tall. And whatever this was, it cleared about 45 feet in what looked like a single jump. It moved like lightning. Whatever it was, it wanted my niece. It jumped behind the car, out of my line of sight, and was waiting for her. She still doubted my warnings and grabbed the flashlight and walked back towards the car. As she entered my driveway, she stopped dead in her tracks, leaned forward as if she could see something. I asked her what she saw. She turned and ran back up onto the porch with a terrified look on her face, saying, "Nope, nope, nope," over and over again. She said it was a figure hiding inside of a tree, that she saw its eyes. I asked her what they looked like, and all she could say was that they looked dull red at first, but as she got closer, they looked dead. I said, "What do you mean dead?" And she said that the pupils looked grey, like the way eyes look when people go blind. She said it was really dark grey, and she swears she could see through it, almost like a dark cloud. She wanted to go out again and took a step down the stairs, and as she did, it revealed itself from the tree. I said, "Get inside." I went in and locked the door. It looked like a tall human-shaped being. It was really tall and looked ominous as hell. The next morning, we did a height comparison to the tree limb she saw it stand over, and it put its height to around 9 feet tall, and its eyes were about 6 inches apart. At this point, I don't know what this thing was. After doing some research, I think that this thing was a glimmer man or even a crawler. I looked to see if there had been any other sightings in Benton County, but nothing. More importantly, I swear it would phase in and out, almost like a shadow person, but bigger and more obvious. I believe that this thing can communicate telepathically. This explains why everyone was hearing something that nobody else could hear. Secondly, I think it has a playback-like communication, like a mimic. So when I heard my dog panting, it was probably one of my dogs it had heard. My wife was actually hearing our son crying for help, as he'd recently fell and cried for help. The baby crying would be our newborn baby, who she had just given birth to recently. And it must have heard me call my wife's name and kept telepathically calling my wife's name with my voice. Another thing that my niece had said that night was that she felt compelled to go back outside to it. She said it felt like this thing was communicating with her somehow, and it wanted her to go back outside. The more I read about this thing, the more everything that has been happening over the past year makes sense. One thing that I find extra convincing is that down the road towards the lake, there is a property that is barbed wired off and is a wall of forest with no driveway. A lot of the property down our road is underdeveloped owned land, and on one of the trees there is this large old sign that says "Screamer lives here," with an arrow pointing back into the woods. Now, I have to admit, when I first saw this sign, I laughed, thinking maybe the owner screamed at trespassers who entered his property. But when I did a satellite search of our neighbourhood, that entire section of road has no houses or trails or anything, and it's just pure forest for as far as the eye can see. One of the things that this thing is said to do is make a loud scream. As I was sitting on my porch one night, I did catch some strange sounds on camera, as well as when I passed an area with my flashlight. There appeared to be something, but when I came back to it, there was nothing. Again, due to the lighting, it's very hard to make out. I haven't felt comfortable going out since my niece just came back from a week's vacation in Florida. So we plan to sit out there a couple of nights and try and see if we can catch anything. This stuff has been happening for a while now, but it was random and far apart. Ever since the last incident, I have seen things that I can't explain, but they seem to be happening almost on a daily basis now. Last night, when my niece arrived, we went out onto the front porch to welcome her. I did notice something that looked like a face staring at me. But what was weird was that as I was staring at it, it moved back into the shadow without moving, if that makes any sense. The one thing that I would like to add in this update that I hadn't thought was connected was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. My wife and I had been in an argument about something silly. She decided to walk back into our woods to clear her head. I was on the back patio when I noticed her walking down our shooting range. I asked her where she was going and she said to cool off. Now, I know the chances of something happening to her were slim, but I found it odd that she would choose to go into the woods rather than simply walking down the road. I quickly got dressed and went down to try and bring her back. I went to the end of the range and called out her name. After a few minutes of calling out, I heard nothing. Not a peep or a twig or anything. Now, the weird part is that it is impossible to move around these woods without making any sound, especially for her. I was worried that she was walking too far, but I had to get back into the house as our children were alone. It freaked me out because it was as if she had vanished. I went back in the house and debated calling someone, but figured I would give her a little more time. I went to the back patio and waited. After about an hour, I started to get really worried. I called out her name again and decided that I would call if she hadn't returned at an 1.5 hour mark. Another 20 minutes went by. She came walking back out of the woods, angry that she had worried me so much, yet also relieved. I asked her what was she thinking. She said, "What?" As she came back into the house, she came in and looked at me like I was crazy. I said, "Did you not hear me calling out to you?" She said she only heard me once, and she replied, now this is where it gets crazier. She said, "I've only been gone for 10 to 15 minutes. Why are you freaking out?" When I told her that she'd been gone for 1 hour and 20 minutes, she didn't believe me. She also said that when she went down there, she didn't go very far. But when she turned around, she started walking and got worried that she was lost. She said she didn't recognize where she was, but something told her to keep walking. She said it felt strange and that the air felt different. When she came back out of the woods, she was relieved to see the house. Now, the part that upsets me the most about this was that where she said she was is impossible. I was literally standing 20 to 30 feet away from that spot. If she'd been there, not only would I have seen her, but she could have talked to me in a normal voice. More concerning is that you can see the house from this spot, and how she felt lost is mind-boggling. I don't know what this was. I thought that again she was just losing her mind. After reading responses, I feel that what happened to her was real. I plan to go back where she was with her to prove that you can see the house from there, but I want her to show me exactly where she went, as well as talk me through everything. I know some people have to be thinking that we are crazy, but I promise that I will do whatever it takes to get proof. I'd just like to add to this, after speaking to my niece about her encounter, she said that she felt compelled to go out even though she knew it was wrong. She said it felt like it was saying, "Come out here and see what I am." But also, in the back of her mind, she knew it was crazy and dangerous. I actually had to tell her a few times that I wasn't allowing her outside. I agree this is the last straw, and we need a security system, along with trail cameras on the outer perimeter. I also would like to swap out my floodlights with ring camera floodlights. I've been told these things avoid cameras, so maybe if I get enough of them, I guess we will see. It feels good getting this off my chest. The few people I tried bringing this stuff up to have literally looked at me like I have lost my mind. I have to admit, after seeing what I saw, I began to question everything. I live in Northern Europe. My country is cold and covered by a large forest and several lakes. My family consists of my mother, father, and an older brother, who is 3 years older than me. Now, he's really important to the story. And now it's also important to know that my parents' house is in the middle of nowhere. Just forest all around it. There aren't even proper roads or any streetlights. And the nearest neighbour lives really far away. In my country, winter comes early and lasts longer than summer, so the days are dark almost all year round. My father is a fireman and my mother is a nurse, so they've always been on night shifts. They have left me and my brother home alone since we were quite young. I don't know if it's even legal to leave us alone, but my brother has always been good at taking care of me. This particular evening was close to Christmas. Both of us were on winter break, but my brother still went to ice hockey practice. He was really tired that night after practice. Mother and father had gone to work at night and left us alone. I was 8 at the time and my brother was 11. We often slept next to each other downstairs in our parents' bed, but I decided to be a big girl that night and sleep in my own bed upstairs. I really just wanted to play my Nintendo, and I knew my brother wouldn't let me. My brother was so tired after training and he just wanted to go to sleep. We ate, brushed our teeth, and went to our rooms upstairs. Now my room faced the forest, and his room faced the only dirt road. There was a hall and a toilet between our rooms. My brother must have fallen asleep right away, but I played and played. Played for so long that I lost track of time. I was under my covers in case my brother came to scold me. Then I started to hear something outside. However, I didn't pay attention to it at first. I've lived all my life in the middle of the forest. You can hear voices from there all the time. The small voices changed in a second. Someone started shouting, almost screaming. It sounded like a grown man who was wounded. I lifted my head from under the covers, startled, and listened for a moment. I called out my brother's name, but he didn't answer. I got up from my bed and ran to my brother's room. He slept soundly. I started rocking him awake. At the same time, I saw from his alarm clock that it was 2 a.m. My brother woke up confused. "Do you hear that?" I asked in a whisper. My brother's eyes widened and all sleep vanished from his eyes. He sprang up. He didn't say anything. He walked towards my room. The shouting came from somewhere in the forest. We stood together in my room and stared out into the darkness. "I think someone needs help," I said quietly. My brother's expression didn't change. His face was like stone. No one needs help of 2 kids. Besides, if he needed help, he would be screaming for help. My brother turned around, and he was right. I heard no words, just a screaming. My brother walked downstairs and I ran after him. Our house has 3 doors. He tried each of them to make sure they were locked. He took our father's headlamp because it had the strongest light. Then he picked up the house phone. Now it was 2010, so not all the kids had their own phones. He made sure all the lights were off and took my hand and started to lead us back upstairs. Then he stopped. The shouting had changed. It no longer sounded scared or needy for help. It sounded irritated, almost angry, like it was annoyed that we didn't come out looking for it. My brother squeezed my hand and pulled me upstairs. He stared at my room for a moment before he pulled me into his room with him. He closed the door and sat behind his bed, pulling me into his arms. It was dark everywhere. My brother hadn't turned on the headlamp, but he had 112 ready on the phone, which is our country's emergency number. We sat there in silence. The sound had come closer until it was clearly behind the window of my room. We heard someone banging on my window, and I started to sob. My brother stroked my head to calm me down, but it didn't help. I was so scared. The sound seemed to be coming closer and closer. It had climbed the fire escape under my window and was now travelling along the rain gutters towards my brother's window. Then it became quiet. It stopped screaming, but we could hear it clinging to the rain gutters to get closer to us. Then it was too quiet. My brother turned on the headlamp and pointed the light towards his window. Nothing. He turned off the light and waited a moment. Then he pointed the light at the window again. Nothing. He turned it off. Then there was a big crash, as if a big pile of snow had dripped from the roof down to the terrace. My brother flashed the light in the window. There was something on it. The kind of trace that is left when you breathe too close to the glass in cold weather. There was a trace of mist on it. My brother immediately turned off the light. Whatever it was, it had fallen down because my brother's window has nothing to hold on to. We started hearing moaning. It sounded only partially human. It sounded more like a bear. If you've ever heard the sound a bear makes when it's been shot, that's what it sounded like. But it had a touch of manness to the voice. Then it became angry and it threw a full tantrum. It started hitting the wall of the house. I remember squeezing my eyes shut and pressing my head against my brother's shirt. It raged for a while, but started to whine and moan again, and it no longer sounded human. I can't describe what it was like, but it didn't sound natural. My brother dropped the headlamp on the floor and hugged me tightly. We listened to the sound for quite a long time. I don't remember at what point I fell asleep, but I woke up in the morning. The beautiful sun reflected against the white snow. I was laying on my brother's bed while he was sitting next to me reading comics. He smiled. Had I been dreaming? I didn't have time to say anything when we heard the lock on the front door open. It was 9 o'clock. Dad had come home. My brother cheerfully jumped out of bed and ran to greet Dad downstairs. Maybe I had a nightmare and went to sleep next to my brother. I mean, it didn't sound impossible, especially since my brother didn't mention it in the morning. I convinced myself that I had really had a nightmare that just felt real. I believed for so many years. However, that changed. Now my brother came to visit me yesterday. Nowadays I live in the capital of my country, far from my mother and father, because I go to uni. My brother broke up with his long-term girlfriend, and I promised that he could bunk in my place as long as he needed. We had a lot of fun, just like the old times. We drank some wine and watched a movie, and just talked about everything. Then our conversation started to get a little deeper, which usually happens after drinking wine. I turned to look out my window. Winter was coming, and it was already dark. It brought back childhood memories, and I told him about a dream I'd had when I was little, while looking at the street lamps outside. This darkness reminds me of when I had a nightmare as a child. I dreamed that someone screamed behind my window and I hid in your room with you. Wasn't I a strange girl? I laughed and turned to look at my brother. My brother is now 23. He is huge. He's into bodybuilding and has a blonde beard. He looks a bit like a Viking, and I've never seen a look on him like that as an adult. He looked at me with big eyes. He was pale, like he had seen a ghost. At this point, I felt freaked out and asked him, "What? Do you remember that?" he asked me. And it got quiet. I asked him what he meant, that I thought it was a dream, and I was so confused. My brother looked really startled, as if I had digged up a memory from his mind that he wanted to forget. I told him to answer me, and that I thought it was a nightmare. I then became startled myself. My brother shook his head. "I thought you wouldn't remember that. You were so little. I hoped you'd forget." My brother looked at me blankly and told me his side of the story. He told me how I'd fallen asleep in his arms from exhaustion. He pushed me to his bed, but he didn't fall asleep. He sat by my side all night like a guard dog. The morning had begun to dawn. The sound began to fade until it just disappeared. My brother couldn't sleep, so he decided to start reading comics to pass the time. And in the morning, when our father had come home, my brother had gone out to look for tracks. But since it had snowed all night and morning, all the tracks were covered. For the next week, my brother visited my room several times a night to make sure that I was sleeping safely. We started talking more about what happened. Neither of us ever mentioned what happened to anyone. I asked him why he didn't call 112, but he just shook his head. Who would have believed me? I mean, he was right. It would have sounded like a prank. My brother also said he was annoyed that he didn't flash the light to my window sooner. He would have wanted to see what the creature looked like. I was just happy that I didn't see anything. I'm also happy to know I'm not crazy and that it wasn't a dream. I have a witness. My brother experienced it too, and he remembers it better than I do. No one else has to believe me, and nobody else would. Of course, it's also possible that somehow we created the whole thing in our heads with no physical evidence of what happened, and it happened years ago. It's very possible that we were just kids with overactive imaginations. I'm certainly not denying that possibility. However, I am interested to know if anyone else has experienced something similar, and if you have, did you see it? I was actually a little nervous before because I saw some kind of animal that I just can't explain. And also, I feel absolutely crazy for even thinking that it may or may not have been a werewolf. I haven't really talked about it much, only to one of my closest friends, who I'm pretty sure thinks I'm making this all up. Now, I'd taken a small trip and rented a cabin in Wisconsin. I'm not going to go into much detail on the location, due to the fact that I own property there as well as my family. Now anyway, this cabin is close by the lake, and there's maybe 1 or 2 other cabins in the area that are close by. Otherwise, it's just all forest and kind of isolated, except for the occasional minimal boat traffic in the distance. So one night, me and a few friends, so there were 4 of us in total, including 2 children, my daughter, and my friend's son, we decided we were going to have a bonfire. Now the fire pit is located toward the rear of the cabin, and beyond that is the woods, so we're facing away from the lake. We're waiting for it to get dark, so we collect some firewood and put up stacks and set everything up as normal, like we've done every other time we've been out there. Everyone had gone inside to get blankets and such, and me and my daughter were still outside. My daughter was closer to the deck, sitting on the steps, and I was near the fire pit. I've poured lighter fluid onto the wood and tossed in a match. The fire slowly began to grow. As I'm looking out past the fire, I noticed a fairly tall creature with shaggy, dark fur. So I saw this thing just staring directly at me with yellow, glowing eyes. It had an elongated face, which looked to be very dog-like, and it was making heavy breathing sounds, as if it was almost struggling to inhale. I instantly dropped everything I was holding and ran towards the deck, lifted my daughter up and ran for the door. Once inside, everyone asked what happened and why I was so scared. Just as everyone was trying to comfort me, an eerie howl could be heard from outside, much louder than I've heard ever before. And everyone else heard it too, but they chalked it up to being a wolf or a coyote. I know what I saw was no ordinary wolf, and a bear? That just didn't seem plausible. This thing was tall and thin around the middle. It was hunched over and wheezing. I'm not entirely sure what this was. And yes, we did go back outside moments later to put out the fire. There was no sign of it. I mean, I wouldn't even go looking. Now, I didn't get a chance to see this very clearly because I was like, nope. But it appeared to have long and lanky paws. I don't even know if they were claws though, but I didn't want to stick around and find out. This is 100% true, and I am still scared to go out there. I went out pigging with one of my best mates all the time, but this one time, the dogs lose their shit and go to jump off the back. So we stop and let them loose, and they shoot off like they're on the trail of something beside a really tall dam bank. So, we think we're under some pigs. We were standing there and could hear their bells off in the distance, getting further away. Then, nothing. The bush was silent and we started to get a bit unnerved. We felt okay because we were both holding loaded guns, but it was still an uneasy feeling. We stood listening for about 10 to 15 minutes and could hear not a thing. It was almost suffocating. So, my mate started calling his dogs in. He's calling for a good 15 minutes and we still hear nothing. So he says, fuck this. We're going looking for them. As he turned to the car, we hear the bells come from behind us in the tree line, which we thought was weird because it was the opposite direction to which the dogs had left. So we turn around listening and my mate starts calling out to them to come. And from behind us comes the dogs, without their bells. Needless to say, we both shit bricks and throw them on the car and bail to the other side of the place. The whole time, the bells were still jingling like something had them on. Weird thing was, we were a good 400 kilometres from the closest civilization, so we shit absolute bricks and were uneasy for the rest of the night. This occurred around 1999 or even 2000. My best friend and I were avid outdoor adventurers and amateur pot growers. We would frequently find secluded places in the woods that allowed for ample light and shade for plants to grow, and that would not allow them to be easily found. One particular day, we went to an annex of trails located near a New Jersey State Park trail system. The trails weren't in the park, but I'd hiked them before and knew that they weren't frequented. We had gone out that day with our seeds, partially sprouted in moist paper towels. We parked the car at the trailhead and started hiking in. We covered a mile or so and then ventured off the trail and into the woods. We found a clearing, planted the seeds, and tied a few barely visible ribbons off to mark the way to the plant spot to check them in the future. My friend and I got back on the trail and started walking back to the car, when my friend noticed a man in the other direction just staring at us. He was probably in his 30s or 40s, bald head, normal clothes. We didn't think anything of the most part, but we definitely kept looking back, as anyone would, when someone is behind them in the woods. We saw that he was walking 60 or so feet behind us. It seemed weird, but it was probably more so to do with us having anxiety that we'd just planted seeds. We picked up the pace, but the man also seemed to pick up the pace as we weren't gaining any distance. At one point, we decided to just get off the trail and let him pass. We turned off the trail and walked into a thicket of sticker bushes, which I remember vividly getting shredded on. We got deeper into the woods and heard cursing. When we turned around, the man was coming through where we entered. It was at that moment we actually became scared. Mind you, we were two young, strong 19-year-olds, but a man following you into the woods is damn creepy. We made a kind of a U maneuver to outflank him and came out of the woods a bit further down trail. Once on the trail, we ran, and we were running. There was a fork in the trail and my friend went right and I went left. I realised my mistake, as my buddy was going down the correct path and I wasn't. So I turned around and started running back towards the fork to follow my friend. As I was running towards the direction we came from to get to the fork, I could see the man running towards me down the trail. He was a distance away, but not far enough in my eyes. Survival mode kicked in and I ran as hard as I could. I caught up to my friend who was walking at that point. I screamed, "He's after us!" And we both booked it all the way to the car. We got in the car shaking and out of breath. We backed up and started to get out of the parking lot when the man appeared at the trailhead. He stopped there and just stared at us as we drove away. I always wonder what that was all about. Did he want to kill a couple of 19-year-olds? Was he also doing something illegal in those woods and wanted us gone? My buddy and I still laugh and talk about that day, 22 years ago. I'm a 27-year-old female, and I went backpacking alone over the recent long weekend, which was 10 out of 10 beautiful. The second night I camped at a beautiful high elevation lake, which could also be accessed by a short 1-mile trail. So there were a few other campers and several people who were just day hiking or fishing. It was late afternoon and I was sitting on my camp reading when a guy, I'd say mid-20s, walked by carrying a fishing pole and a small cooler. I didn't think much of it, but 5 to 10 minutes later, he doubled back and came and said hi. I said hi and went back to reading, but then without warning, he then sat down on a stump. I was completely taken back by this invasion of my space. He started asking me questions that were really just statements, but in a creepy, amused tone like, "So, you're just reading?" And then looked behind me and noticed my tent and said, "Oh, you're staying the night here alone, huh?" I didn't say anything in response to this in particular, but it's obvious that I am. It's hard to explain, but his vibe was just really off. I was so uncomfortable, that I couldn't even really form words or tell him I was trying to be alone just to get him to leave. I was honestly paralyzed. His eyes were so dead and dark and just drilling into me. I just responded with the likes of, uh-huh, and yep, or something, and just tried to pretend I was still reading. Without warning, he pulls up and cracks a beer and lights a cigarette. Just starts blowing it at me. At this point, I am so uncomfortable and just not responding. Soon, another hiker wandered by and he strikes up a conversation with him. And I took the opportunity to grab my water filter and bladder and pretend to need to get water. I went to the shore and filtered some water super slowly and saw him walk away to go sit with the new guy, which made me so relieved, except he kept looking in my direction. I came back eventually and got inside my tent, and for 20 minutes, everything was fine. I had the rain fly pulled back and was watching the sunset and loosely organising my things when he popped out from behind my tent and stood maybe 1 foot from my door, looking down at me. He didn't say anything, but just started laughing really creepily and fake. Again, I asked, "What?" And his response was, "This is just really funny." I felt literally sick to my stomach and finally responded with something like, "I'm taking a nap now, so have a good night." He laughed again, but luckily he left. Later, I saw him still wandering around the camp with no real purpose, still looking in my direction, often. I had no service, but I wrote down his last name, at least what was written on his cooler, and where he said he was from while talking to the other hiker in my notes app, just in case, and slept with my pocket knife close. I debated leaving camp that night, but ended up staying and just leaving super early in the morning in case he came back. Normally, while backpacking, I think the worst thing that could happen is I might run into a bear or sprain an ankle. And maybe this seems not that bad, but this truly was the most unsettling experience I've ever had in the backcountry. I'm sure I'll be back out soon, but hopefully somewhere far away from this dude. I'm 28 years old now, but this happened to me when I was 9, and I still remember it so vividly. I lived at the time in a seaside resort called Blackout, which is in England. It's a modest 4-bedroom house. The area itself was good, with very little crime or concern, until that night. I shared a bedroom with my brother. We had bunk beds, and I was on the top bunk. The bedroom was on the first floor at the rear of the property. My bedroom overlooked the back garden. One night, I was awoken by the sound of a window lock being tried. I opened my eyes and looked towards the bottom of the bed, which faced the 4 large windows. To my horror, someone was outside, perched on the window ledge, attempting to get in through my window. I froze in horror, not daring to allow them to see I was awake. I remember sliding back down into my bed, keeping as still as possible. I lied there for no more than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. My heart was beating that loudly, I was sure it would give me away. With my eyes closed, I stayed still, listening to them shuffle across to the next window. Unlike before, I could now hear a screwdriver or something in his hand, which was being used a little more forcibly to get in. Without moving, I opened one eye, ever so slightly, to see whether I could make out who this person was. A security light at the back of the property suddenly triggered mid-look. I panicked. Surely now he'd seen me. Now he knew I was there. Staring back at me was a dark figure, black clothes, wearing a matching balaclava, only his eyes on show. This horrible, startled, piercing look. Clearly having been caught off guard by the security light, he froze and just stared. He didn't move an inch. I was now sat up, equally as stunned, staring back, locked by fear. I immediately jumped off the top of my bunk bed. There wasn't time for stairs, screaming for my parents as I ran out of the room and into theirs. They tried convincing me it was a bad dream and told me to get back into bed. There was absolutely no chance of that happening. After a couple of minutes, they agreed to go and investigate, which simply entailed looking through my bedroom window. Nobody was there. They had gone. I got back into bed, still almost frozen with fear. What if he'd gotten in? He might be in the room right now. He could comfortably fit in my wardrobe, or even under the bed. My brother, who was 6 years my junior, had slept through the whole episode and was no use. Looking down my bed towards the window again, I noticed the latch on the fourth window. It had been left open inside. A simple pull from outside would have easily opened it. I shut my eyes and remember silent tears falling down my cheeks. If he was in the room and knew I was awake, he might harm me to keep quiet. Pretending to be asleep seemed the best option, and eventually I must have nodded off. I was woken up the next day by the sound of my cat outside screeching in the garden. Daylight came through the windows, and the bedroom didn't feel anywhere near as scary as the night before. Cautiously, I walked towards my bedroom window. I noticed marks around the window locks from the outside where the paint had been scraped. It wasn't a bad dream. My cat screeched again, and I heard a commotion outside below me in the garden. 3 police sniffer dogs were parading around. A policeman was stood talking to my mum. I rushed outside, but was quickly ushered back into the house and was told to take the cat indoors. The look on my mum's face. I knew she was trying to hide something from me. The ambulance, which arrived a short while later, gave it all away. Apparently, it turned out someone had broken into the house next door, through the back bedroom windows. The motive? Well, it appeared to have been a simple theft. But the elderly lady who came across the intruder had been found dead at the bottom of her stairs. The police never found out who it was, but then again, they never dusted our windows for prints, as my story was never told. We left the house and moved away within 6 months. I still think they feel guilty for not listening to me and not acting differently. Even to this day, my parents don't wish to talk about it whenever I try and bring it up. The Indigenous people of Australia have up to 75 different dialects, depending on the region where they come from. So the name of this being could be called something entirely different in the other dialects. But my local tribe called it the Kardaicha man. Growing up in an outback town, you get a lot of freedom you take for granted. But that freedom could also get you into trouble. Big trouble. This occurred when I was about 11 years old. My Aboriginal friend and I were walking around town, bored out of our brains during school holidays. The rest of our friends had gone away for the holidays. So we decided to go fishing in our secret spot down by the old Aboriginal encampment, where they moved after the occupation of their land in our area, which was about 15 kilometres out of town. We headed around to the butchery to pick up some meat for yabbies, to his house for rods and traps, and then my house for food, drinks and a shovel. We planned to dig for our worms out by the river. We got all the necessary supplies and headed out along the side of the highway. We were walking and talking and just stuffing around when we finally got there. We headed down the sand road and came across a fence that blocked off the sacred land. There was a statue of some sort on the boundary, and my mate stopped and said a few words. He always said that his dad told him to do it, otherwise the bad spirits could see us. I told him that it was silly and skipped it. We go down the back of the camp and walk on another kilometre or so and find our spot. And there was a nice breeze blowing through all the old ghost gums. We could see the fish jumping and knew we were in for a good day. We started to dig around for worms and come up with a few big good ones and get to fishing. The day gets on and it turns out that we are terrible fishermen with rods, so we abandon them and get in the water to catch them with our hands. Turns out I'm also terrible at that, but my mate ends up catching a decent sized yellow belly, so we keep it for eating and showing off, obviously. We hadn't kept an eye on the time, and before we knew it, the sun had set. My friend starts getting really nervous, saying that it's time to get out of here and that we really need to leave. I asked him why, and he says that it's really unsafe to be out there after dark. I laugh, and at that exact moment, there was a huge splash in the water behind us. We both shit a little, but with our child bravery, we check it out and couldn't say a thing, just ripples on top of the water. We dismiss it as a big fish and start to pack up our stuff to leave. By the time we start our march back, it's pitch black, and we can barely see our hands in front of us, and forgot to pack a torch, so we kind of fumble our way through the bush until our eyes adjusted. We were walking for about 20 minutes when we stop. We can hear heavy footsteps off to our left, about 15 metres away. We strain our hearing and the footsteps stop. We then realise that the bush is silent. No wind, nothing. Our eyes have adjusted to the dark, so we can kind of see where we're going, and we realise we've overshot the road by about half a kilometre, and whatever was making the footsteps was between us and the road. So we decide to push on and come out along the highway further up the road. That was a mistake. The footsteps keep persisting, sometimes closer and sometimes further away. I swear at times I could hear low mumbling. I kept saying to my friend, but he told me to shut up and don't look back. It can't see us, was what he kept saying. So I push on, my feeling getting more and more uneasy. The second we hear a loud crash come from our left on a small animal trail, we were on and my mate grabs me and pulls me off into the scrub, tells me to lay down. As we're laying there, we see a silhouette loom up to the path. It kind of has an outline of feathers on it and is extremely tall and humanoid, but sickly thin. It is going from tree to tree, not very far from us, and is looking all around, snapping its head and making a low mumbling sound as it moves. It was looking for us. It keeps moving around where we were and suddenly stops, looking back down the path, and we hear what could have been a kangaroo jump off into the bush. The being let out an unearthly scream that hurt our ears and shoots off down the path faster than anything I've ever seen. I looked to my mate and whispered to him if he had just seen what I had. But when I looked, he'd had his head in his hands the whole time. He answered, "We're not allowed to look." His cheeks were all tear-stained. He whispered, "I told you he would see you." We waited what felt like 2 hours and then bailed out of the bushes and ran the remaining distance to town, losing our fish along the way and some of our stuff. We finally made it, and every time I tried to bring it up with him, he told me to shut my mouth or it would come back. So I eventually stopped trying. I haven't been able to sleep right since. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centred around custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and professional colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case because of some experiences he related that I had been previously unaware of regarding my ex's behaviour out at networking events. After this initial call, he started calling on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. This wasn't someone I knew well prior to the separation, and he was much older than I was, but claimed to have experience with divorce and custody, and I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him, since his testimony was important, per my lawyer. I kept things friendly, but I always had a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day when my son was very sick, and when I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me, which I honestly appreciated. But after that, he was dropping by the house uninvited, or he would stop by with cookies for my son, and so forth. Again, I kept telling myself to keep things polite. The divorce is coming soon, Don't make this guy mad. He had called me out of the blue, and I was worried at this point that I was walking a very fine line, being polite, but clearly not interested, and that if he got mad, he might decide to go testify for my ex and say who knows what. During this time, he'd also helped me set up a security camera system my dad had mailed me, and at one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key the same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and wanted to do it alone. Just after the painting day, he came around, uninvited and unannounced, with magazine photos of decor, and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish the decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave, started ignoring his calls, and took my son and dog to stay with my parents for several weeks to avoid a drop-in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he would have gotten the hint. The following morning, I took my son on an outing. I think it may have been the zoo, and we both came back hot and tired. Put my kiddo down for a nap in my bed and decided to close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later, and it took me a moment to realize something was way off. As I'm blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table that I most definitely had not put there. There was a post-it note on it, something about planting it in the yard. I started shaking immediately because I recognized the handwriting, and stood up to go splash some water in my face, and decided whether or not to call my parents or the police. I didn't want any trouble because of the divorce. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized that the mirror was covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages that were intended as like love notes or with affection, but which all of them scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how these notes could possibly have gotten into my house. My front door was definitely locked, but as I went from room to room, there were notes everywhere. I mean hundreds of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinets. There was even one inside my coffee maker. I started grabbing all of them and putting them into a pile. When I got to one in the kitchen, that made my blood run cold. It said, "You're cute when you think no one is watching you." And I realized that there was a security camera pointed right where that note was left. The one he had helped me set up months earlier, when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics, sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted I should not call the police. Remember, custody battle. But that he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the security cameras, which had been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. So there was one on the front porch, but 3 inside the house, including one in my bedroom. This man could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. He had just paid attention to my passwords when I was setting up the system, but the only way I can figure out that he got into my house is that he must have made a copy of my house key the day he had it. And because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to warn me, which also scared me, if I'm honest. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put up that many notes so quickly. And he was right next to my face and feet from my son while we were sleeping, and somehow thought this was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what he was going to do when he realized that he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night, and I was home alone on the phone with another friend from out of town. At about 10 p.m, this man showed up at the door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities, and demanding to be let into his house. Gone were all the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left. And this happened on St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he'd been drinking. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. I thought he was crazy, but not that crazy, and figured if I called the police, he would get in more trouble if my son was there. But he knew the schedule, so I knew it was him. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts several times, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered he had friended my mum on Facebook and was therefore still able to see all the photos of us that she posted or shared. And there was a huge argument when I saw she had left her computer logged in. A conversation they were having about me and how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes even as I was packing, and I am more than relieved that he no longer knows where I live. I didn't post photos of my new house online, not the front anyway, and I have changed the privacy settings on my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go, the networking events he attends, and I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos because I was so traumatized enough. I didn't want to see just how much danger we could have been in. Hopefully, he never sees or hears this. But you know who you are. I hope our paths don't cross ever again. I was somewhere between 19 and maybe 21, give or take. And like most weekends, I was with my friends in the woods partying. We were all living in southwestern Ontario, roughly outside of the city of Kitchener-Waterloo, where the furthest outer suburb meets the edge of the countryside. This area of Ontario is interesting because it's a transition zone located on the limestone country around the Niagara Escarpment, presumably near some caves, as many sightings have been, and features areas of mixed broadleaf and coniferous forest, farmland, remnants or prairie and savanna, and cool, dark, boggy eastern cedar woodland, some of which is extremely old growth. The landscape, for Americans unfamiliar, is similar to the landscape in the eastern portion of the upper Midwest. I hear Wisconsin in particular is basically the same. I won't go into detail or answer any more questions about specific locations, as this is where I spent my teens, and I have friends and family still living within a kilometre or two of where this story takes place, so please respect that. The last thing I want is for the backdrop of this story in particular to blow up some kind of hotspot, unlike the area down east in my last story, which was a random transient spot on a county road. We had one of our usual bush parties in the Oak Savannah in a nature park, about 5 kilometres along the trails from my best friend's parents' place, and 15 or so of us were walking back, sometime well after midnight. The weather was warm and muggy, and so my best guess puts it at somewhere between July and September. There was probably 15 of us, and we were walking single file along the boardwalk that crossed through the cedar swamp on the edge of the park. Most of the gang, my best friend included, was quite drunk and stoned, and we were having a rowdy, raucous good time. I was actually reasonably sober, hadn't had anything to smoke, both of which were very unusual at the time, and was bringing up the rear since I had a flashlight and was a little concerned about one of the drunks tripping and falling, as it was an exceptionally dark night, as cloudy summer nights can be in the southern Ontario under the thick forest cover. I'm making this part clear because I want it to be evident that I wasn't really impaired, and that even though I'd had a few drinks, I still had the clarity to be concerned with us getting back without incident, and felt in control enough to follow the group by myself with the lights. As I mentioned, the atmosphere was pretty jovial and crude, as is typical for 15, 20-year-old guys liquored on a summer night. And while there were preceding times where the forest felt weird and foreboding, despite all being experienced outdoorsmen in much more remote areas, and spending most of our weekends in the woods, this was not one of those times. Being as I was hung back from the group a little bit, I wasn't entirely locked into the gang's conversation, and distracted and kind of doing my own thing. I was sweeping the flashlight around somewhat to my left and right as I enjoyed the nighttime scenery. I swept the flashlight to the right and noticed something kind of strange. I thought I spotted a deer darting away from the light of my flashlight off into the thicker, drier area of the trees beyond the cedar swamp, maybe 30 to 50 feet away from the boardwalk. As I watched it amble on sort of a semi-parallel diagonal alongside us and out of view, I started to feel sick. Something about the way it moved and the way it was shaped didn't make sense for a deer or any other animal I knew. We don't have much in the way of wildlife in southwest Ontario anyway, because of how much human land use there is. And outside of small irrelevant animals like foxes, raccoons, etc., there are really only deer and coyotes. I would consider that bears and wolves are possible in theory, but highly, highly unlikely, as far as I've ever heard. The animal, a skinny humanoid, was the same shade of white as the thing I've seen before. It had that same luminescent greyish white as the reflective strips on a pair of jogging pants, though duller. I saw no face in this instance either, though the head was equally bald and round or even oblong, like a primate's. Again, it appeared to be bipedal, though bent over on all fours, butt up in the air. Unlike the galloping creature that I saw in Nova Scotia, this one seemed to be moving more slowly, at a pace akin to a jog. It seemed to be trotting, almost like the gait of a happy dog, and I remember noticing tons of hip sway as it walked, almost in the squat sort of way a marmot, skunk or badger would move. This makes sense for the way a bipedal animal would move on all fours anyway, since hinging at the hips means that the ball and socket joint of the hip can't rotate fully, and the hip flexor muscles, being shortened, aren't able to be used with the same fluency for lateral forward movement. The thing made zero sound despite running off into the woods right in front of me, which was bizarre, considering the number of sticks littering the floor of the forest. I immediately felt my voice catch in my throat as immense primal fear gripped me. I realised nobody had seen it, all corked out of their heads and bantering about whatever topic. But also at the same moment, it occurred to me that if I raised the alarm, the whole group would panic and scatter, and ensuing chaos meant somebody would be, at the very least, likely to fall into the swamp or potentially attract whatever I just saw to our group. Was it stalking us? Was it startled and retreating out of fear? Or had it been discovered and was escaping the way a cougar does when you see its face straight on? I had no idea, and still am not sure. My heart was beating through my chest, but I continued to bring up the rear, constantly swinging my flashlight around and checking over my shoulder as the hair, just like in the Nova Scotia experience, stood straight up on my neck and arms. We reached the road without further incident, but I was deeply, deeply disturbed. Now, several of us have had much more subtle, odd experiences in the forest before this, including hearing strange noises, unfortunately, similar to that typical crawler call. You know, the wood knocking and the feeling as if they were being watched or hunted. And once I personally had felt the intense and overwhelming intuition that I had to leave immediately. Nobody else in the group had felt as such, but I convinced them to go. My best friend, who unlike Buddy from the East Coast story, is extremely interested in the paranormal. He was equally as terrified as I was when I told him about this the next day. We still walk around those woods when I visit home. We've been quite cautious though. We're always inclined to expect something weird to occur when we head there at night. Sighting in northern Nova Scotia. Even though I enjoy considering certain aspects of the paranormal, I'm not really one to take stuff like that at face value at all. I believe a lot of the things people claim to experience have real, material explanations. I have racked my brain trying to think of a known animal that fits the colour, texture, morphology and gait of what I saw and come up with nothing every time. I'm open to suggestions. Both of my experiences were in Canada, one in Nova Scotia and another in Ontario. I experienced this sighting with one of my best friends and roommates at the time, and we often talk about what happened. I ran over the details with him before posting this, and it's the exact same way that he remembers it as well. He actually said reading my retelling gave him chills. If you have information or experiences about this phenomenon in Eastern Canada or adjacent areas of the US, I'd love to hear from you. The Nova Scotia story. In February 2021, I was living and working on a homestead on the South Shore, outside of Lunenburg. I planned a last-minute road trip up to the Bay of Fundy one Saturday morning as the snow was starting to melt and the weather was mild, and my buddy decided to come along. The bay is due north along a rural county highway, 100 kilometres from where we lived. The province has a similar geology to Maine and other coastal parts of New England, and even though most of the mountains are really just big hills and rolling uplands, geologically it's part of the Appalachia. The highway in question slowly rises in elevation from lower, sandier, rockier South Shore toward a high ridge called South Mountain, then plunges into the Annapolis Valley, then rises sharply again over a parallel ridge, which then drops into the bay. It was a mild, overcast day, about 5 degrees Celsius or 41 Fahrenheit when we left. While the clouds were threatening on the drive up and during our outing, the weather held until we started to head back. About 7 p.m, we get in the car to leave the bay. It starts to rain very hard. As we crest North Mountain, the rain turns to sleet, and by the time we're over the ridge, the temperature has dropped and it's snowing quite hard. We cross the valley and begin to climb South Mountain, and the snow is absolutely torrential, like walnut-sized East Coast snowflakes. At this point, I'm beginning to worry. I was raised in the snow belt in Ontario, so I'm used to very heavy snow, but this is bad, even compared to what I'm used to. On a number of occasions, that winter, I had seen 1 to 2 feet of snowfall between the time I went to sleep and the time I woke up before dawn. At this point, it's quite dark. I'm driving a 4x4 SUV with winter tyres, but despite the truck and my experience, I'm limping along at 10 feet of visibility in front of me at best. I'm concentrating hard just to stay on the road without the whiteout in front of me looking like hyperspace from Star Wars, and the wet, slushy snow rapidly covering the lines of the already sketchy rural 2-lane. I remember going 40 to 50 kilometres an hour in an 80 zone, which is 25 to 35 miles per hour in a 50 zone, and feeling like that was the best I could do. We were well on our way home at that point and came to a place where the empty highway dipped into a wetland area. It was a musky bog-type environment full of half-frozen mire and small black spruces and birches. The highway ran over a small sort of bridge or retaining wall, protecting a culvert that led the wetland pass under the road. Just as we crossed it, on the very edge of my visibility, so I'd say about 10 feet ahead, something ran from my left side across the road and to the right. It was humanoid in shape, quite emaciated, bright, sickly white even against the snow. It appeared to be between my height and my brother's. I'm 6'3" and he's 5'8". It had a loping biped on all fours gait, like a human bent over, its arse in the air, and head sloped down, much longer legs kicking back and up as it bounded forward, and tons of shoulder and scapular movement with the front limbs, almost the way a wolf runs. It was a true gallop in the equestrian sense of the term, alternating front and back legs. I was struck by how fast it moved. It seemed agitated and excited, maybe even scared or angry. Remember, we were travelling 45 kilometres an hour, and this frenzied animal, or whatever it was, passed across the road as fast or faster than we were travelling. I didn't catch a face, and I'm glad for that, but just the glowing colour and smooth texture of its skin made me feel weird. It was such a thorough white, it almost reminded me of the whitish grey strips of reflective material on jogging gear, though not as luminescent. It was duller, but brighter than any fur or feathers I'd ever seen. I was genuinely terrified in the moment. I've spent many years in the outdoors and in rural areas and feel very comfortable being in the sticks at night, but something about what we just saw seemed wrong on a fundamental level. The same way the sound of cutlery scraping on a plate or nails on a chalkboard touches something basic and primal in your brain that signifies bad. I knew somehow that it was a bad thing. Not dangerous in the way a bear encounter makes you feel, but very off. I instinctively locked the doors and began to speed up, and 5 or 10 good seconds passed before I managed to speak. "Did you see that?" and barely finished my sentence before my buddy countered with, "What did you see?" So I knew he saw it too. He's the opposite of the type of person that would ever claim interest or belief in any paranormal or cryptids, and doesn't have any interest in spooky shit. He even looks down on stuff like astrology and tarot cards, never mind creatures in the forest. While I'm not a huge junkie for this kind of stuff, I am cautiously open to it. He most certainly is not, and before this happened, he would actively degenerate people who claim to have seen anything unusual. A dark, eerie vibe settled into the car then. Things felt very oppressive and threatening. Other than the moderate stress of the snowy road, only a few minutes prior, we'd been enjoying our evening and chatting away as we usually did. All the hair on my body was standing straight up, and we sat in silence most of the way home, seemingly under the same dark cloud. As we get closer to Lunenburg and lower in elevation, the snow became sleet and then rain again, and the tense mood began to lift. We stopped on the way to pick something to eat, but still don't have much to say to each other, and ate mostly in our own worlds. We headed home and got to bed, but both of us barely slept that night. Now, we were living on the same plot of land as a medicine woman who was very well versed in a lot of her culture's folklore, and out of curiosity, we went and knocked on her door after breakfast the following day and asked casually if she was familiar with anything like what we had seen. She was actually visibly bothered that we asked, and she didn't want to talk about that at all. Said it was not good, and we never got a real answer out of her. I'm not sure if she was personally creeped out, or maybe there's some kind of folklore evidence among the First Nations of the East Coast. I spent months afterwards considering what it could be. My first thought was a canine or a bear that was piebald, albino, mangy, or some combination of the above. But the thorough baldness, the speed, the sheer size, and the gait and morphology, also their proportions, just do not fit the bill at all. You cannot hide the way a bipedal animal with longer legs than arms moves on all four legs, the way it kicks back with its glutes, and the rounded spine of its low back, the way its shoulders control its forelimbs, the low head posture. None of it adds up to a straight-backed herbivore or the head-forward posture of a predator. None of it. Nova Scotia is known for unexplained occurrences, but this was my first experience. I seriously need help and am terrified out of my mind. So I'll start off by saying I've never believed in anything paranormal. I'm a pretty science-based dude. I always look for a logical explanation, and I still am for this encounter. So if anyone has any ideas, let me know. I don't have much time for leisure with work recently, being having to accept some pretty awful shifts to get by with COVID times. So I've lost my ability to go out on my evening walks, which are a method of stress relief for me. So 3 nights ago, I decided to just go for a late night walk. I put on my headband flashlight and decided to take a path I hadn't in ages. There's a small trail near the back of my neighbourhood that goes about 4 miles deep into the woods. My plan was to walk about 1.5 miles in and take the parallel path to come back. I make it down to around 1.3 miles, according to my Fitbit, and I start getting that feeling I'm being watched. I turn off my headlight and sit still to listen. At this point, I'm more concerned there's a guy following me who is up to no good. I heard clear footsteps in the leaves off the trail, and they've been behind me for nearly 5 minutes. I stopped, thinking it was an animal or another walker, and became worried. Sitting there for about probably 3 to 4 minutes, and I hear nothing at all. I turn back on my headlight and decide to start walking back home. About 2 minutes later, I hear footsteps again. This time, it sounds different. It sounds like 4 feet instead of 2, and it's walking at the same increased speed that I am. I turn around quickly with my headlight and my phone light and point it behind me. Silence. I get angry and yell out, "Leave me alone! I'm going to call the cops! And if you come at me, I have a knife!" Silence. I yell again to get the fuck out of here and start walking towards where I heard the walking. Roughly 20 yards out, I see what looks like a literal naked man running full speed on all fours into the woods. Normally, I'd chalk that up to drugs, but my area does not have a drug problem, and there were some details that lead me to believe it wasn't a person. For one, they were damn near hairless, completely bald, pale white skin, and the way it ran on all fours looked natural. Not like when you try to run on all fours and look stupid. It looked like its bone structure was designed to walk on all fours. There was no hunched look, their back was flat, and they were really fast. Last thing that happened was straight out of a horror movie. I hadn't heard anything in a while on my way back, but kept turning around to be sure. With about 3 miles left to go until I was in the clear, I hear a mad dash through the leaves. I whip around and it stops on a dime. I see the edges of its head behind a tree and yell loudly to try and intimidate. What I heard next, I'll never forget in my entire life. It cackled like a monkey, a noise I've literally only heard in nature documentaries. The tone was that of a mockery, a predator having fun with me. I didn't stick around. I sprinted as fast as I possibly could back home. I'd love to believe this was some prank or some rabid, ball-diseased coyote, but I got a pretty clear look at it. It wasn't. It had human feet and human hands, a human head and a human buttocks, but nothing else about it was human. I called the cops after and told them a man was following me. I didn't want to say some creature because they'd think I'm crazy. They didn't find anything, but they did see quite a bit of activity in the leaves and dirt about 50 feet from where the trail was, leading far back into the woods before it got to a large stretch of grass where no footprints were seen. So after some internal debate, I decided I was going to go back because it would eat me up not knowing what this thing was. When I first saw it, I had zero idea what it could be. I figured some drugged out or mentally ill man, a prankster or sickly deformed animal. After letting it all settle though, there's just no way any of that was the case. I was trying to justify it in my mind because I've always been a heavy skeptic of anything paranormal. And to be fair, I still am. But I'm warming up to the idea that crawlers may actually exist. So I messaged 3 of my buddies, told them everything that happened in detail over text, and asked them if they'd come look with me. Them, being non-believers like me, and also just loving adventure and spooky stuff, were more than excited to go. 2 of the friends have guns, and so do I. So we all brought them. Just to be clear, 1 friend had a pistol, and 1 had a shotgun. I also had a pistol. Now, the other friend was in charge of holding the 2 flashlights to give us some light. 1 being a phone flashlight, so he would be ready to take a picture at a moment's notice. We waited until 9:30 p.m, when it was completely dark, and headed down the same trail I did last time. My heart was pumping out of my chest, but I felt more confident having friends there. They were joking around and thought this was cool, and I tried joking back a few times, but the reality was I was pretty nervous. We walked the full 1.5 miles I had planned on walking last time and didn't encounter a thing. We had prepped for so long though and didn't want to give up quite yet, so we kept walking. About 5 or 8 minutes later, at close to the 2-mile mark, we started hearing some noises way back in the woods. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough for us to take notice. I told my friend to turn off the flashlight for a second and we listened. Bipedal footsteps made their way closer to us. Still far, but definitely coming our way. It sounded like they were wearing boots or something because of the heaviness of the steps were quite loud. That, or there were a lot of leaves, which, to be fair, is a possibility. It was off the trail, so it's all woods back there. Once the footsteps made it about 20 to 30 yards away, I called out asking if someone was here. The footsteps stopped, but only for a brief second. A second later, the bipedal footsteps turned into what sounded like something sprinting on all fours in our direction. My friend immediately turned on the flashlights, but there was nothing visible through the dense forest. At the beginning of the trail, the forest is pretty clear, but further back, it gets a lot more dense, so it was hard to tell. Once he turned on the light, the footsteps stopped as well. None of my friends were talking. Paranormal believer or not, hearing that will scare the shit out of you. My friend unholstered his pistol and kept it by his side. He looked at me and I could see he wasn't having a good time anymore. My friend holding the camera was visibly shaky and was darting his glance between all of us. The third friend shortly after yelled into the woods, "I see you! Come out! Stop fucking with us! We have guns and we'll shoot! I don't want to hurt you over some dumb joke. Now come on!" We hear that sound again. The one that sounded like a cackle. Only this time, it was more of a yell or shriek, aggravated noise. I don't even know what to compare it to. I just know it gave me goosebumps. My friend immediately shot his gun into the woods, causing my ears to ring horribly due to me being right next to him. I couldn't hear for shit, but I noticed his gaze went from the spot we heard the footsteps, from over to the right of the spot, about 90 degrees. I followed his gaze for about half a second, caught a glimpse of once again, a tall human-like thing running on all fours behind a tree. He started walking towards that direction, but my friend with the flashlight stopped him. He made the point that it was a buckshot. The chances he missed were slim due to the fact that the tree it was next to was covered in evidence that the shot was on target. My friend made a scary point that we hadn't considered. What if it hit it, but didn't hurt it? What if he was right? What if it took a shotgun hit and it didn't even fall over? My estimate is that it was between 6 foot and 6'4", and maybe between 140 to 165 pounds. So if it could still run after that shot, it either didn't get hit, or it's not something we want to mess with. We hear the cackle I heard the first time, that mocking noise. Not so much an aggravated noise this time, more so a noise that it gave me the impression it was having fun, or enjoying the fear we blatantly had in our voices. No more footsteps, but my friend shot in its general direction again, ears ringing again. I couldn't see anything, but I did see a small glimpse again of it running off deeper into the woods. Could only see its rear for a second or two before it was too far to be seen by the light. This meant it had to be running pretty fast. I don't want to give a number, but if I had to guess, it was easily around 20 miles per hour or so. Nothing a human could do on all fours, that's for damn sure. We turned around and jogged back home. Upon getting home, we talked about what we saw. Nobody was disputing my story now. We had all seen it. We talked all night. I showed them some of my comments on my last post where they suggested a crawler. We read a lot of posts and some of them matched our experience and some didn't. But we did all agree that if this was paranormal, that a crawler was the best guess we had. Now we are all on the same page. We still don't know if we buy into the paranormal claims, but this one is starting to convince us. We realised at the end we hadn't even looked for pictures. We asked my friend who had the phone, and he shyly admitted he hadn't even thought to take a single picture. I'm not gonna lie guys, I was so terrified. I didn't even open the camera app a single time. I was just trying to make sure it wasn't behind us or charging us. I'm sorry. We told him not to worry. None of us would have been any better about being calm enough to set up a picture. I never saw its face still, but the friend who took the shot swears it didn't have one, or at least had no eyes. He couldn't see if it had a mouth, but it was about a third out from behind the tree, and from his angle, he saw it was blank from the nose area up. Or, if it did have eyes, it was too black to be noticeable in the dark. We did all decide though, we're going to go back. We'll be more prepared this time. We'll do our research, we'll have a camera strapped to us, or always recording. We know what to expect, so we'll be more calm. Crawlers are known as humanoid cryptids. They are known for their distinctive, pale, hairless, and ashen skin. They're emaciated in appearance and average a range of 5 to 8 feet in height upright, but they're typically seen crawling on all fours in a hunched over position, hence the name crawler. They have black, sunken-in eyes, sharp teeth, no lips or nose. There have been reports of them in the northern parts of the world, and even Australia. Crawlers tend to dwell in small enclosed spaces like caves. Think of those creepy-ass creatures from The Descent. Most crawler sightings are at night in open areas, particularly forests or the bush. Crawlers have been known to let off an ear-piercing screech when approached. I'm 20 years old and I live in Austria. I finally got my first real job after graduating a technical school, and I'm very happy with my current life. But recently, memories started to pop up, and I can barely sleep. I have the feeling I need to finally talk to people about what I witnessed over the course of years. There is only 3 people who know about this until now. My fiancé, my mother, and my grandfather. I grew up in a pretty rural area within Austria. We moved there when I was 6, and since then I've seen things. It began by having that feeling of being looked at when passing our windows at night. Initially, I thought it might just be me being a bit scared of the dark. Usually I'd see our cats outside of the windows, and mostly it was nothing. One day, I remember going down to grab myself a bottle of water, and I saw them looking at me from the outside. We had what we call a winter garden. It's basically a small room attached to the main building made out of glass. In front of the winter garden, from the outside, was a floor made of gravel. There were 2 to 3 different creatures, varying in different heights, crawling on their long, skinny arms. Their skin was grey in tone. I would actually say a mix of grey and a slight touch of brown. No hair, just skin. Now, I can't remember the amount of fingers or the toes. I remember the shape. The reason I said they looked was because they had no eyes, humanoid body, but very long and skinny. I can only describe their body type, like one of those very skinny prepubescent kids from school. The bigger one was around 2.5 meters in height. I know this because that was the height of the winter garden. The second one was a bit bigger than me when I first saw him, so I assume about 1.7 meters in height. They stared at me, walked around the house, and peeked through the second set of windows that were located in front of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen and the winter garden are connected. I didn't move or scream. I was shocked. I didn't want to move or breathe or look directly at them. I was afraid that if I did do any of these things, they would either hear me or see me, even though they had no eyes. After a while, they moved away towards the forest that was basically 5 meters away from the house. I ran to my bedroom, hid in my bed under my blanket. The next morning, I decided not to tell my dad or my mum because it felt unreal. Did I actually see anything? Was it even a dream? The feeling when I saw them was like a curtain fell down. Years pass, I'm now 17, and I can barely remember what happened. But I gained an insane fear of the outside around our house, especially at night. I felt like I was being watched any time my head peeked at the windows. Only when there was no snow. I don't know why. But at this point, I was only living in my parents' house on the weekends, because I'd already moved to the housing my school had, which was about an hour and a half away from the house. It was a Saturday, and I went down to make myself a midnight snack. I saw them, having their heads turned into my direction, their movements similar to an animal looking at you, looking at me, and walking. The shock kicked in, and I stayed still for 20 minutes. I know this because we had a working clock in the kitchen. I eventually moved because they showed no aggression. They just looked at me, and as I turned to grab my water, I ran up to my room and started to cry, out of shock most likely. The following months, it happened again and again, to the point that I got used to the pull myself together routine and just move. I even ate cornflakes while they watched me. At this point, I was already convinced I'd gone insane. Everything I saw had to be an illusion. Hyper-realistic, schizophrenia, something like that. Closely after I turned 18, I started looking a bit closer at how the surroundings reacted to them. The gravel, the stones, they moved with them stepping on it. They moved their arms and feet, just so slightly. The shock set in again, and again I started to cry. They moved as always, slowly away around the house and back to the forest. Now, the night that haunted me the most. Every time I try and remember this night, the fear and panic start to set back in. So I have this balcony in front of my huge bedroom window that also has a door that you can completely open. In front of the balcony was the gravel floor. So basically, the winter garden's roof was my balcony. It was a really warm night, so I had my window and door open completely, and the curtain blocking potential insects from coming inside. I was laying on my bed trying to sleep when I hear steps on the gravel. It could have been the cats, but then I keep listening. I use the light from the screen of my phone and face it towards the curtain. The curtain moves barely to the side, and the head peeked in. The biggest one of them climbed up the winter garden on top of the balcony. I went into complete shock and my body froze out of fear. Its head moved backwards and the curtain wiggled a bit. I also just remembered that there is quite a lot of cave systems within the area. After this last incident, I moved away and thankfully never saw them again. For some context, I live in a major city and currently don't do a lot of driving due to ongoing issues with my car. Plus, the pandemic has made me turn to more delivery apps in general. So one day, around 1 p.m, I decided to order some lunch after doing a lot of cleaning. I placed the Uber Eats order and found something to watch while I waited for the food. Within a few minutes, a driver accepted the order and I noticed right away that the driver, Anthony, was on a bike, didn't have a profile picture or any deliveries on record. At first, I wasn't alarmed at all. I was almost amused, like, oh wow, guess I'm this person's first ever customer. But then, a full 30 minutes passes, with no driver movement on the app. And at this point, I think maybe something is glitching out, or maybe the driver's stuck. I contact support via the chat option, and they ended up assigning a new driver because they couldn't reach the first one. Odd, but whatever. Now is when it starts getting a little weirder. The new driver assigned is in the exact same spot as the original driver was. They are also on a bike, also have no profile picture, and have no prior deliveries as well. And this driver's name was Laurie. I let another 20 minutes pass with no driver movement before I message them myself and say, "Hi there, are there any issues with the order?" The app shows that the driver saw the message, but no response. All this time, I'm checking to see if my Uber Eats is maybe experiencing issues. There was none I could find. And at this point, well, I'm definitely weirded out. I'm mostly just hungry. So I contact support again to request some assistance. They reassign the driver again and apologise for the inconvenience. Same deal. They also tried to contact the driver with no response. Finally, the third driver assigned is the exact same scenario. Same spot, on a bike, no profile picture, and no prior deliveries. Only this time, the name is Robert. And before I can react and go about cancelling the order at this point, because I'm just tired of dealing with this, he suddenly has my food and immediately messages me the following: "Hello, have your food, what's your phone number?" And I respond right away with, "I'm not super comfortable giving my phone number out when you can just message me here." And he responded again with, "What's your number? Be there in 10. How old are you?" And at this point, the alarm bells are going off. And I contact support immediately to have the order cancelled and get further assistance. I get connected to Uber's safety team, who informs me that the order has been cancelled. I'll be refunded. And started taking down the details of the strange interactions. As I'm giving the woman on the phone the info she needs, I'm starting to calm down and thinking this was just some creep or something. And that's when I hear a man's voice at the front door. "Hello, miss." He uses my name. "I have your food." And I can't even describe the chill that went down my spine because of the way he said it. Making things even worse, the Uber safety woman on the phone with me heard him as well and goes, "Is that him? We cancelled the order." I poked my head around the door. Now the main heavy door was open. The metal screen door was closed and locked, but this allowed us to see each other. and I got to get a look at him. And when he saw me on the phone, he went from smiling to looking furious. He suddenly got right up against the door and kept asking who I was on the phone with. And at this point, I've started asking him to please leave because he's making me uncomfortable. And he's getting more and more angry. Starts pounding on my door and grabbing the doorknob while shouting to be let in. The woman on the phone is asking if I'm okay. The man is still shouting. So basically, I'm in full meltdown mode at this point and hurriedly closed the heavy door. He ended up walking away from my house about a minute after that and back up to the sidewalk. And for a moment, I thought he'd gone. So I finished my conversation with the Uber safety woman so she could submit the report. Once she submitted it, I called the police and told them what happened. They weren't incredibly helpful at first, since he actually didn't break in or put his hands on me. And they told me if he came back to call again, and they would send an officer out. I did end up having to call them again and give a full report and description of the man, since he didn't end up leaving right away. He stayed in the neighbourhood for almost 20 minutes. According to one of my neighbours, after she heard the yelling, she saw the man I described walk back up from my house to the sidewalk and hop into a truck with another man in the passenger seat. And they apparently just sat there, staring at people walking by and being incredibly sketchy. And that's when she walked back towards my house and asked me what happened. Luckily, she was able to give myself and the cop a description of the vehicle and the other man as well. So basically, this was a very bizarre and uncomfortable experience, and I wanted to share it. Maybe to see if anyone else has ever experienced anything like this, because honestly, I'm still pretty shaken up and will be avoiding delivery apps for quite a while.